The sound of Richard Harper's boots echoed against the porch as he returned home that night. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of another double shift at the docks, and his fingers still stung with salt water and rope burns. The house was quiet, dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight as though hiding something. He dropped his tool bag by the door and climbed the creaky stairs toward his bedroom, the one place that had always been his refuge. But when his hand pushed the door open, his breath caught. The lamp glowed warmly, and beneath its light was Melissa, his son Daniel's wife, sprawled across his bed in silk pajamas. Her hair spilled across the pillow that once smelled faintly of his late wife's perfume. Her eyes opened slowly, heavy-lidded, as if she had every right to be there. Richard froze in the doorway. For a long second, all he could hear was the steady tick of the wall clock. What are you doing here?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but tight. Melissa stretched lazily, like a cat disturbed from sleep, and pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders. "This room is more comfortable," she said casually, her tone dismissive. "Daniel and I agreed it suits us better." Before Richard could respond, footsteps sounded behind him. Daniel appeared, leaning against the frame with his arms folded. His face was calm, almost rehearsed, as though he'd prepared for this moment. "Dad," Daniel said flatly, "Melissa needs the room. You can sleep in the garage." The words hit harder than a punch. Richard stared at his son, his jaw tightening. "The garage," he repeated slowly, as if testing whether he had heard right. Daniel didn't flinch. "It's just a space. You'll be fine there." Melissa's smirk widened from the bed. "Yes, Richard. It's not that bad. After all, you barely use this room anymore." Richard felt something inside him crack, not anger, not yet, but something deeper, something that tasted like betrayal. He looked at his son's eyes, searching for even a flicker of shame, but found only cold certainty. His gaze shifted to the dresser, where a faded photograph stood, Daniel as a boy on Richard's shoulders, both of them smiling on a sunlit beach. That image once reminded him of the sacrifices he had made, the endless shifts, the skipped meals, the bills paid late so his son could have a better life. Now it looked like a lie. "You want me in the garage," Richard said softly, more to himself than to them. His voice didn't rise. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, as if sealing something inside. He turned without another word and descended the stairs. The garage door groaned open, welcoming him with the scent of gasoline and rust. The air was cold, and the shadows clung to the corners like mold. He sat on an old workbench, the silence pressing heavy against his chest. In his hand, he held the photograph he had carried down with him. Daniel's boyish grin stared back at him. Richard brushed the dust from the glass frame and whispered, "I gave you everything." A drop of water from a leaking pipe splashed onto the floor. In that moment, Richard realized something: this wasn't just Melissa's doing. His son had chosen this. He lay on an old cot in the corner, the smell of oil sharp in his nose. Above him, the faint hum of the house carried on without him, laughter, footsteps, Melissa's voice calling for Daniel. They had pushed him out of his own life. And in the silence of that garage, Richard made no threats, no angry vows. But deep in his chest, something began to stir. Not rage, not yet. Something colder. Something patient. The tide had shifted, and though his son couldn't see it, Richard knew, this was the moment everything would change. The next evening, the Harper household smelled of roasted chicken and garlic bread. Melissa had set the table neatly, candles flickered, wine glasses gleamed, and laughter floated from the dining room. To anyone outside, it looked like a family dinner. But Richard felt the difference the moment he stepped inside. His boots left faint streaks of dirt on the polished floor, and Melissa's eyes narrowed the second she saw them. "You could at least change before dinner," she muttered, sliding a dish into the center of the table. Richard said nothing. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, the warm water stinging his cracked knuckles. When he returned, the dining table was already full, Melissa at the head, Daniel beside her, their plates heavy with food. He scanned the room. Every chair was taken. Daniel glanced up, almost as if waiting for the realization to hit. "Dad, why don't you just stand? It's easier that way." Richard's jaw clenched. He could feel the tightness in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He walked slowly to the counter, pulled a plate from the cupboard, and served himself quietly. Melissa's smirk was sharper now. "You're used to being on your feet all day, aren't you? What's one more hour?" She let out a small laugh, sipping her wine. Daniel chuckled, though uneasily. "Melissa," he warned half-heartedly, but he didn't tell her to stop. Richard ate standing by the wall, his back straight, his expression unreadable. He cut the chicken carefully, each slice deliberate. Every now and then his eyes flicked toward Daniel, searching for the boy he had raised, the boy who used to cling to his arm in crowded streets, who once whispered, "You're my hero, Dad." But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who wouldn't even give him a chair. Halfway through the meal, Melissa leaned back and stretched. "You know, Daniel, we really should start thinking about making this house more modern. Fresh paint, maybe tear down some of these old shelves. Your father has no eye for style." Richard set his fork down. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "This house has held you since the day you married. Every nail, every brick, I paid for with my hands. If you change it, respect where it came from." Melissa rolled her eyes. Always the sentimental stories. She reached for Daniel's hand across the table. "Don't worry, darling. Once it's ours fully, we'll make it shine." "Ours." The words sliced deep. Richard didn't argue. He simply folded his napkin, placed it neatly on the counter, and left the room without another sound. That night, while Melissa and Daniel laughed in the living room, Richard sat alone in the garage with his old notebook. The pages were filled with numbers, bank slips, property records, years of careful savings no one knew about. He flipped through them slowly, his calloused finger resting on one page, the deed to his beach house. His lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. He remembered building it with his late wife, the two of them sanding the deck together, dreaming of quiet mornings with ocean air. He had kept it hidden, a place just for them. Now, for the first time, he considered what it might mean to return there, not as a grieving widower, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. He closed the notebook and slid it into his bag. Above him, the laughter from the living room continued, sharp and careless. Richard leaned back against the cold garage wall. His voice was barely a whisper, but steady. "You won't laugh for long." And with that, the seeds of his revenge were planted. The morning air tasted of salt when Richard stepped out of the bus at the quiet coastal stop. The sun was just rising, streaking the horizon in soft orange light. In his hand, he clutched a worn leather key ring, the keys he hadn't touched in years. They jingled faintly as he walked down a narrow road lined with pine trees, the ocean's rhythm growing louder with every step. At the end of the lane stood a house of glass and stone. Wide windows reflected the sea, and the deck stretched out toward the waves like open arms. It wasn't just a house, it was a memory carved into wood and concrete. He and his late wife, Margaret, had bought the land decades ago, saving every extra dollar, working weekends sanding beams, painting walls, fixing shutters. It was their dream, but after she died, Richard had locked it up, unable to face the silence inside. Now, his fingers shook as he slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a sigh, and the scent of cedar and sea air rushed out. Dust motes floated lazily in the light pouring through the windows. Richard stepped inside, setting his small suitcase on the polished floor. He walked slowly from room to room, running his hand across furniture covered in white sheets, each corner whispering memories. In the master bedroom, the bed was neatly made, the last thing Margaret had done before they left it behind. He pressed his hand to the quilt, his chest heavy but calm. That evening, Richard opened the sliding glass doors to the balcony. The ocean roared beneath him, the tide crashing in steady rhythm. He sat with a glass of red wine, something he rarely allowed himself, and for the first time in years, he felt free of the weight that had sat on his chest since Margaret's passing. But freedom wasn't the only thing stirring inside him. Later, under the dim light of a desk lamp, he spread out his notebook. The same one he had pored over in the garage now looked like a map of possibilities. There were savings accounts, stock investments, small properties quietly rented out. Years of sacrifice, years of living simply, had built a quiet fortune. He had never flaunted it, never spoken of it. Even Daniel didn't know. He called Quinn, his old friend and lawyer. When the man's steady voice answered, Richard spoke in a low tone. "It's time, Quinn. I want to protect what Margaret and I built. No loopholes. No surprises." Quinn was silent for a moment. "Richard, are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," Richard replied. He looked out at the waves, his reflection faint in the glass. "I'm done being pushed aside in my own life." The next day, contractors arrived quietly to dust, clean, and ready the house. Neighbors passing by nodded politely, unaware of the storm brewing. Meanwhile, back in the old house, Daniel and Melissa enjoyed what they thought was victory. Melissa redecorated, draping throws over Richard's old chair, moving his tools to the shed. Daniel laughed with friends about how Dad finally loosened his grip. But cracks were beginning to show, groceries ran low, bills piled on the counter, and Melissa's shopping trips drained what little money Daniel brought home. At night, in their bedroom, the one that once belonged to his father, Daniel tossed restlessly. He didn't admit it out loud, but the silence felt different now, colder somehow, as if something vital had left with Richard. On the coast, Richard lay in his bed with the window cracked open, the ocean breeze curling through the curtains. For the first time in months, he slept deeply. But his last thought before sleep was not peace, it was a spark. The spark of a plan that would make Daniel and Melissa understand exactly what it meant to strip him of his dignity. The salt in the air was no longer just memory, it was warning. The Harper house looked the same from the outside, white siding, shutters slightly faded by sun, but inside, the air had shifted. Without Richard, the hum of order was gone. It started small. A dripping faucet in the kitchen, a sound Richard would have fixed within an hour, echoed day and night. Melissa shoved a dish towel under it and forgot. Then the refrigerator light flickered, spoiling milk. The lawn grew wild, crabgrass curling against the porch steps. Melissa lit candles to mask the sour smell from the fridge, but her irritation grew. She had expected freedom when Richard left, but instead the house felt heavier, like it demanded something from her. One Friday evening, Daniel stumbled in late from work. He dropped his jacket on the couch, eyes bleary. "What's for dinner?" he asked, voice flat. Melissa was pacing, bills spread across the table. "Dinner? Are you joking? The electric's due, the water bill is double, and your father's stupid autopay isn't working anymore." She shoved a notice toward him. "You know he handled all of this, right? I don't even know which account to pay from." Daniel rubbed his temples. "I'll figure it out tomorrow." "You said that yesterday." Melissa's voice sharpened. "Do you even realize how much work he covered? All I hear now is that damn faucet and the neighbors whispering about the lawn. It's embarrassing." Daniel exhaled, sinking into the chair his father used to occupy. For a fleeting second, guilt flickered across his face. He could see his father sitting there, steady hands turning wrenches, scribbling numbers in his notebook, humming while fixing a hinge. Melissa noticed his hesitation. Her tone softened but with a sting. "Don't start feeling sorry for him. He'll be fine wherever he crawled off to. We needed this house for ourselves." "You said so." Daniel nodded weakly, but the words didn't settle right. That weekend, Melissa invited two friends over for wine. They lounged in the living room, laughing too loudly, feet on Richard's old coffee table. One of them wrinkled her nose at the faucet drip and the overgrown lawn visible through the window. "Didn't your father-in-law used to keep this place perfect?" one asked. Melissa forced a laugh. "He was obsessive. We're not servants. It'll get done." But in the corner, Daniel sat silently, staring at the table Richard had built with his own hands. Each ring of laughter seemed to chip away at his pride. Late that night, after the guests left, Melissa curled up in the master bed, Richard's bed, their bed now, and muttered, "He should have left years ago." Daniel didn't answer. His eyes were on the ceiling, his chest tight. He wondered if pushing his father to the garage had been a mistake, but pride sealed his lips shut. Meanwhile, on the coast, Richard stood barefoot on his balcony, watching the waves gnaw at the shoreline under a silver moon. His phone buzzed, a voicemail from the homeowners association near his old neighborhood. Complaints had been filed, lawn unkept, trash bins left out, noise disturbances. Richard played it twice, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let them feel it," he whispered into the wind. "Let them feel what absence costs." The tide below thundered louder, as though echoing his resolve. For the first time, the Harper house without Richard didn't feel like home, it felt like a burden. And Daniel and Melissa were beginning to learn that when you strip a man of dignity, you also strip away the foundation holding everything together. The house was no longer theirs, it was hollow, a shell collapsing under the weight of their arrogance. The ocean wind rattled the balcony doors as Richard stood in the kitchen of his beach house, pouring himself coffee. The early morning light shimmered against the glass walls, casting long streaks of gold across the floor. He liked mornings here, quiet, predictable, steady. No arguing voices, no mocking laughter. Only the waves, constant and loyal. But that calm was broken by a knock. Sharp. Hesitant. Richard's brow furrowed. Few people knew this house even existed. He set the mug down and walked to the door. Through the wide glass pane, he saw them. Daniel, his son, shoulders slumped, clothes wrinkled, face pale from sleepless nights. Beside him, Melissa stood with her arms crossed, sunglasses shielding her eyes though the morning was cloudy. Her lips pursed with impatience, but Richard caught the way her hand gripped her purse strap too tightly. Richard opened the door. The smell of sea air rushed in. "Dad," Daniel said softly, almost boyishly. We need a place to stay. Just for a while." Melissa broke in before Richard could respond. "The house is falling apart. Pipes, bills, everything. It's unlivable." Her tone was defensive, clipped. She shifted her weight as if she were standing on trial. Richard leaned against the frame, studying them. His eyes flicked over the dark circles under Daniel's eyes, the forced composure in Melissa's stance. They weren't proud of being here, but desperation had driven them. For a long moment, he let silence hang heavy between them, the waves filling the gap. Then, without expression, he stepped aside. "Come in." Relief washed over Daniel's face. He almost smiled as he guided Melissa through the doorway. The inside of the beach house stunned them. High ceilings, polished wood floors, the ocean stretching endlessly through the windows. It was nothing like the modest home they had been living in. Melissa's eyes widened to spite herself, off flickering before she masked it with disdain. "You never told us about this place," she said, voice sharp but thin. "It wasn't yours to know," Richard replied, his tone even. Daniel swallowed hard, shame prickling at the back of his neck. "Thanks, Dad. We just need time to sort things out." Richard nodded slowly, walking toward the kitchen counter. From a drawer, he pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a short document, typed neatly. Melissa frowned, picking it up. "What's this?" "House rules," Richard said simply. "Temporary stay. No changes to the house. No entering rooms that aren't yours. Respect the property. Sign, and you can stay in the guest room." Melissa scoffed, but Daniel's eyes lingered on the page. He knew his father well enough to realize the rules weren't optional. After a long pause, he took the pen lying beside the folder and signed. Melissa followed reluctantly, her scrawl jagged with irritation. Richard folded the paper back into the folder. His expression didn't change, but inside, the first step of his plan clicked neatly into place. As Daniel and Melissa carried their bags upstairs to the guest room, Richard stood by the balcony, sipping his cold coffee. He watched their reflections in the glass, Melissa's eyes darting greedily at the artwork, Daniel's gaze fixed on the view like a man who couldn't believe what he had almost thrown away. Richard's grip tightened around the mug. This house had been his sanctuary, the dream he and Margaret built together. Now it would be the stage. They thought they were guests. They thought they were safe. But Richard knew better. The ocean roared below, as though it, too, understood. The tide was turning. The guest room door clicked shut behind Daniel and Melissa, their suitcases thudding against the hardwood floor. The room was beautiful, soft white curtains, polished oak dresser, and a wide view of the ocean stretching endlessly across the horizon. It was more than either of them expected, and that unsettled Melissa. She dropped her bag onto the bed and tugged the curtains aside. "So this is what he's been hiding," she muttered. "A palace by the water. All this time, he lived like a poor man, while this sat empty." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped, staring at the signed document they'd just left on the kitchen counter. His father's rules echoed in his head: no entering rooms that aren't yours. Respect the property. Melissa smirked. Rules? Really? He thinks we're children. She opened her suitcase and pulled out a silk robe. He won't last. A man like him wants company. He'll forgive everything once he realizes he needs us. Downstairs, Richard moved with quiet precision. He had returned the folder with their signatures to the drawer, but not before slipping it into a fireproof safe. Then he walked to the corner of the living room, where a small red light blinked. A discreet camera, angled perfectly toward the hallway and stairwell. Another one was hidden near the guest room door, and another above the kitchen. Richard checked the live feed on his phone, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes. He had learned long ago that trust without proof was weakness. The first breach came that very night. Melissa, restless, slipped from the guest room long after midnight. She padded softly down the hall, her silk robe whispering against the walls. Richard's master bedroom door stood slightly ajar, the faint smell of cedar drifting from within. She glanced over her shoulder, then pushed the door open. Inside, the room was neat, understated, framed photographs on the wall, a worn leather chair by the window, Margaret's quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Melissa's eyes flicked greedily to the walk-in closet. She stepped inside, fingers brushing along rows of pressed shirts and a locked chest on the floor. "Figures," she whispered with a smirk. "Even his secrets are boring." She didn't notice the tiny red blink from the corner of the ceiling. The next morning, Richard sat at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee. The sound of waves rolled in through the glass doors. When Melissa entered, all polished smiles, he simply glanced at her. "Sleep well?" he asked. Melissa froze for half a second before smoothing her expression. "Of course. Your guest room is adequate." Richard set down his cup slowly, eyes steady on her. He didn't accuse. He didn't mention the footage he had watched on his phone at dawn. He only nodded. "Good. The house feels lighter when people respect boundaries." The silence that followed was sharp, like glass underfoot. Melissa forced a laugh and busied herself with toast, but Daniel noticed the tension. He glanced between them, unease settling deep in his stomach. Later, when Richard left to walk the shoreline, Melissa hissed, "He knows." Daniel frowned. "Knows what?" "That I went into his room." Daniel rubbed his face, groaning. "Why would you do that?" "He gave us a place to stay." Melissa cut him off, voice sharp. "Don't you see? He is more than he's letting on. We deserve this house, Daniel. He doesn't even use it. You're his son. It should come to us." Daniel didn't answer. But that night, as he lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling, Richard's words came back to him: respect the property. In the shadows of the hallway, the camera's red light blinked once, twice, recording everything. Richard knew patience was his greatest weapon. Let them break the rules. Let them think it was a joke. Every misstep was another thread in the web he was spinning, one they would never see until it was too late. And as the tide outside slammed harder against the rocks, the house itself seemed to wait, holding its breath for the storm that was coming. A week passed in uneasy silence. Richard's beach house remained immaculate, the rules obeyed only in appearance. Melissa's smiles were sharper, Daniel's silences longer. Richard let them stew. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He only watched. On a clear Tuesday morning, Richard dressed neatly in a navy jacket and khaki slacks. He moved with a quiet purpose as he picked up his car keys from the counter. "Going somewhere?" Daniel asked, stepping into the kitchen, still in a wrinkled t-shirt. Richard buttoned his cuff. "Just business." Melissa appeared behind him, sipping coffee. "Business," she repeated, suspicious. "What kind of business?" Richard looked at her, eyes calm, unreadable. "House matters." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The words lingered long after he walked out the door. The next hour found Richard standing in the living room of his old house, the one Daniel and Melissa had claimed. Only now, it was different. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, highlighting the cracks Melissa never patched and the stains left on the counters. Two men in suits walked slowly from room to room, clipboards in hand. A third man, wearing a developer's badge, trailed behind Richard, gesturing to the space. "With some renovation, this could make an excellent investment property," the developer said. "Tear down some walls, open up the floor plan. Young families would line up." Richard nodded, his face impassive. "Do what you need to do." Outside, a bright notice had been nailed into the lawn, "Property under evaluation, sale pending." When the neighbors saw it, whispers began immediately. That evening, Daniel and Melissa returned from errands to find the notice glaring at them from the yard. Melissa froze on the walkway, her coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup. "What the hell is this?" she hissed, ripping the notice down. She stormed inside, the paper crumpled in her fist. Daniel's hands shook as he dialed his father's number. Richard answered on the second ring. "Dad. There's a sign in front of the house. A for sale sign. What's going on?" On the other end, Richard's voice was steady, almost too calm. "I've decided to downsize. That house doesn't suit me anymore." Melissa grabbed the phone. "You can't just sell it. We live there." Richard paused. "You live there because I allowed it. Don't confuse permission with ownership." The line went dead. Melissa paced the living room like a caged animal. "He's bluffing. He wouldn't throw his own son out." But Daniel wasn't so sure. His father's tone had been final, like a man closing a door forever. He sat heavily on the couch, staring at the worn carpet, the unpaid bills scattered across the table. For the first time, he realized they weren't tenants of fortune, they were trespassers in someone else's empire. Melissa slammed the crumpled notice on the table. "We can't let him do this. That house is ours now. We earned it." Daniel's voice broke through, quiet but raw. "Earned it? By throwing him into the garage?" Melissa froze, her jaw tight. She looked away. Back at the beach house, Richard stood on the balcony, the ocean roaring beneath him. He held his phone loosely, Quinn's voice still ringing in his ear from their earlier call. "All set," the lawyer had said. "The sale is in motion. They'll receive official notice within days." Richard closed his eyes, letting the salt wind whip through his hair. He could almost hear Margaret's voice in the waves, calm, resolute, urging him forward. "They thought they took everything," he murmured to the night sky. "They haven't seen what everything really means." Below, the tide surged higher against the rocks, relentless and unforgiving, just like the justice he was preparing. The kitchen of the beach house was silent except for the slow ticking of the wall clock. Richard sat at the table, a folder neatly laid out before him. Across from him, Daniel shifted uneasily, his hands clasped together. Melissa hovered behind, her arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line of disdain. Richard opened the folder with deliberate calm. "Do you remember the paper you both signed when you arrived?" Melissa rolled her eyes. "That silly list of rules? Please. We signed it to keep you happy. It doesn't mean anything." Richard's gaze locked on her, steady and cold. On the contrary, Melissa. It means everything. He slid the document across the table, the crisp edges brushing against Daniel's knuckles. Daniel stared down at the familiar lines of text, his own signature glaring back at him like an accusation. Richard tapped a paragraph near the bottom. You agreed to temporary stay, contingent on respecting the property and refraining from interference in my affairs. You also agreed, without reading, I imagine, that any violation forfeits your claim to live here. Daniel frowned, his throat dry. Claim? We didn't think. That's exactly the point, Richard cut in. His voice was calm, but each word carried weight. You didn't think. You assumed. Melissa's face flushed. This is ridiculous. No court would take this seriously. Richard leaned back, folding his hands. It's not about courts. It's about contracts. And I don't need a court to enforce my boundaries. I need proof. He reached into the folder again and produced his phone. With a tap, a video clip played. Melissa, caught by the camera in the hallway, slipping into his master bedroom. Her voice whispered faintly, so this is what he's been hiding. Melissa's eyes widened, her composure cracking for the first time. You were spying on us? Not spying, Richard said evenly. Protecting myself. I've learned that people who treat me like furniture will also treat my kindness as weakness. Daniel's face turned pale. He looked at Melissa, then back at his father. Dad, we didn't mean. You meant every word, Richard interrupted softly. Every smirk, every dismissal. You put me in a garage so she could have my bed. Do you think I forgot that? The silence that followed was suffocating. The sound of waves against the shore filled the gaps, relentless, like judgment itself. Finally, Richard closed the folder and stood. You will stay here until the sale of the other house is complete. Then you will leave. And you will do it quietly, because if you don't, I have hours of footage and a signed document that proves you're nothing more than guests who broke trust. Melissa's jaw tightened. You wouldn't dare. Richard leaned down, his voice low, almost gentle. I already did. He turned and walked toward the balcony, the glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss. The ocean air rushed in, cool and salt-sweet. Behind him, Daniel sat motionless, the paper trembling in his hands. Melissa's fury burned hot, but for the first time, there was fear behind it. Out on the balcony, Richard breathed deeply, the sea breeze filling his lungs. His plan was unfolding, piece by piece. They thought they had stripped him of dignity, but in reality, they had signed away their own claim to comfort. Every step they took against him had been recorded, sealed, and turned into a weapon. And now, like the tide, the truth was rising. The wind off the ocean was sharp that morning, cutting through coats and tugging at loose hair. Richard walked along the boardwalk, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. It was a ritual now, his morning walk before coffee, before decisions. The sound of waves striking the pilings soothed him, steady and grounding. He heard their footsteps before he saw them. Hesitant. Dragging. Not the confident stride of people in control. Dad. Richard turned slowly. Daniel jogged toward him, Melissa trailing behind, clutching her purse like it was the only anchor left in her world. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the redness around her eyes, nor the way her jaw clenched each time the wind pushed her hair into her face. Daniel stopped a few feet away, breathless, desperation painted across his features. Please. We need to talk. Richard said nothing. He simply watched, the gulls circling above filling the silence. Melissa stepped forward, her tone forced but brittle. We can't stay at the other house anymore. The utilities are cut off. The fridge doesn't work. There's mold in the basement. It's unlivable. Richard's eyes flicked briefly to her, then back to the ocean. I told you the sale was already in motion. Daniel's voice cracked. Dad, we have nowhere else. Please. Just let us stay here a little longer. We'll follow the rules this time. I swear. Richard turned then, really looking at his son. The boy he had raised through scraped knees, late-night study sessions, and heartbreaks. Now a man, broken not by bad luck but by his own arrogance. You had a home, Richard said quietly. I gave it to you, and you drove me into the garage. Daniel flinched at the words. His lips trembled as if to respond, but no defense came. Melissa, sensing his weakness, tried to step in. Look, maybe we didn't handle things perfectly, but you can't just abandon your family. You're his father. That means something, doesn't it? Richard's gaze was cold steel. It does. Which is why I won't let my son starve. But don't mistake survival for inheritance. Daniel swallowed hard. What do you mean? Richard gestured toward the Pear Cafe nearby. Sit. We'll talk. They sat at a weathered wooden table, the sea spray dampening its surface. Richard placed a single sheet of paper on the table, a revised agreement. You can stay here, Richard said. But only under these terms. Daniel, you'll work down at the docks. Same place I spent 30 years of my life. Hard labor, dawn to dusk. Melissa, you'll manage groceries and chores, properly this time. If either of you break these terms, you're out. No arguments, no second chances. Melissa's face twisted. The docks? Manual labor? He's not some. Daniel cut her off sharply, his voice breaking. I'll do it. Melissa stared at him, stunned. Daniel. I said I'll do it, he repeated, louder this time. His hands shook, but there was no hesitation in his voice now. Richard leaned back, studying them both. His expression didn't soften, but inside, he felt a grim satisfaction. This was the first crack in Daniel's pride, the first step toward humility. Melissa's glare could have cut glass, but she said nothing more. The gulls shrieked overhead, and the tide crashed harder against the boardwalk pilings. Richard picked up the paper and folded it back into his pocket. Then we understand each other. He rose from the table, leaving them sitting in silence, the wind whipping around them. For the first time, Daniel didn't look at Melissa for guidance. He kept his eyes fixed on his father's back, realizing too late what true strength looked like. Richard walked away, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He didn't need to look back to know they were still sitting there, broken, desperate, and finally learning that his kindness came with boundaries carved as deep as the ocean's tide. The morning sky was pale gray, heavy with clouds that hung low over the Harper neighborhood. Birds scattered from telephone wires as the rumble of engines broke the stillness. 2 yellow bulldozers idled at the curb in front of Richard's old house, their exhaust fumes curling into the damp air. Workers in neon vests unrolled caution tape across the lawn, staking the ground with authority. Inside, Melissa woke to the grinding sound of metal. She pulled back the curtain and froze. Daniel, she shrieked. Get up, something's happening outside. Daniel stumbled to the window, his face paling as he saw the machinery parked on the grass where he once played as a child. A bright orange permit was stapled to the front door, demolition approved. No, he whispered, rushing downstairs barefoot. He flung open the front door just as a worker placed a metal claw against the porch rail. Wait. You can't do this. This is my house. Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. The foreman, a stout man with a clipboard, barely looked up. It's not your name on the paperwork, son. Owner's approval is all we need. Melissa appeared behind him, her hair wild, her robe fluttering in the cold air. She snatched the paper off the door and scanned it. Her hands trembled with rage. Richard Harper, she spat. He signed this? He can't, he wouldn't dare. The foreman pointed at the signature at the bottom. Looks like he dared. The bulldozer roared to life. Its claw descended with a sickening crunch, ripping through the porch rail, splintering the wood that had held the house together for decades. Melissa screamed, her voice sharp and raw. Stop! Stop it right now! She turned on Daniel, shoving him hard in the chest. Do something. This is your father. He's destroying everything we have. Daniel's knees buckled beneath the weight of her words. He staggered back, watching as the machine tore through the siding, each crash echoing through his chest. His childhood memories, the laughter in the kitchen, birthdays on the porch, quiet evenings with his father fixing the steps, crumbled in dust and splinters. Across the street, neighbors gathered, whispering. Some shook their heads, others muttered about family falling apart. A few pitied Daniel, most pitied Richard for having endured so long. Melissa clawed at Daniel's arm. Say something. Fight him. But Daniel couldn't move. His throat closed, his chest burned. His father's voice echoed in his mind, soft but unyielding. You had a home. You drove me into the garage. And now the garage, the walls, the roof, all of it, was being erased in front of him. By midday, the house was nothing but rubble. The bulldozers pushed the remains into piles, the air thick with dust. Melissa stood shaking, her face streaked with tears and fury. She spat into the dirt. He'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. But Daniel didn't answer. He stood still, dust coating his bare feet, his eyes locked on the ruins. There was no fight left in him. At the edge of the block, a dark car idled quietly. Behind the tinted window, Richard watched. His expression was calm, unreadable, but inside, a storm raged. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Justice wasn't supposed to feel sweet. It was supposed to feel heavy, necessary, like the crash of waves breaking against stone. When the last beam fell, Richard tapped the steering wheel once, then drove away, the dust of the demolished house curling behind him like a trail of ghosts. And with every mile, he knew, Daniel had finally seen what consequences looked like. The air inside Quinn's office smelled faintly of leather and ink. Stacks of legal files lined the walls, their spines marked with years of quiet battles. Richard sat across from his longtime friend and lawyer, his posture steady, hands folded on the polished oak table. Daniel and Melissa sat opposite him, side by side, though their bodies told two very different stories. Daniel leaned forward, restless, his eyes darting between the folder in Quinn's hands and his father's unreadable face. Melissa leaned back, arms crossed, her heels tapping against the floor in sharp, angry rhythm. Quinn adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. We're here to review Mr. Harper's estate planning and family trust updates. Melissa scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Estate planning? He destroyed our house. What's left to even discuss? Quinn didn't flinch. He opened the folder and slid a thick document across the table. Plenty. You'd be surprised what your father built quietly over the years. Daniel's eyes widened as the list unfolded, multiple rental properties, investment accounts, stock portfolios, and of course, the beach house. His father's quiet frugality had concealed a fortune. Melissa leaned in now, her bravado slipping. So, it all comes to Daniel, then. As it should. Richard finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. Not quite. Quinn tapped the document. Mr. Harper has placed the beach house into a life trust. He retains ownership until his death, at which point the property will be donated to a children's hospice, one named after his late wife, Margaret. His investments and savings are divided into two categories, charitable foundations and a modest education fund for any future grandchild. Daniel's mouth fell open. A hospice? Dad, you can't be serious. You're giving everything away? Melissa's face burned red. This is insane. That house should be ours. You're his only son. By law, you. By law, Quinn cut in smoothly, inheritance is conditional. And in this case, your signatures on the temporary stay contract, combined with hours of footage documenting your treatment of Mr. Harper, activate what we call a disinheritance clause. Any heir found guilty of elder abuse, neglect, or humiliation loses all claims. Daniel's face drained of color. His own signature flashed before his eyes, bold and careless at the bottom of the page. Melissa shot to her feet, voice shrill. This is a setup. You tricked us. Richard finally looked directly at her, his eyes cold and sharp as the tide. No. I gave you chances. I gave you rules. You thought they were jokes. You signed because you didn't respect me enough to read. That wasn't a trick, it was arrogance. Melissa's voice faltered. For the first time, there was no comeback. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice breaking. Dad. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. You meant every word when you sent me to the garage, Richard interrupted softly. And every word when you laughed as I ate standing at the wall. That was the will you wrote for yourself. The silence that followed was suffocating. Quinn closed the folder with a quiet thud. That concludes today's review. You both know where you stand. Melissa stormed out of the office, her heels striking the tile like gunshots. Daniel lingered, staring at his father with eyes full of regret. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Richard rose slowly, placing a steady hand on the back of the chair before walking past his son. For a moment, their shoulders nearly brushed, the air thick with everything left unsaid. Outside, the ocean wind swept through the streets, sharp and bracing. Richard stepped into it, his coat flaring slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The legacy was sealed, not for those who had mocked his dignity, but for the memory of the woman who had shared his sacrifices, and for children who would never know her but would live in the home built from her name. Justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, final, and written in ink that no one could erase. Would you like me to finish with Chapter 12, Waves for Witnesses, giving the story its final emotional closure and poetic ending? The ocean was restless that evening, the waves crashing hard against the rocks as though the sea itself carried judgment. From the balcony of his beach house, Richard watched the horizon fade into twilight. The sky burned orange and violet, the air sharp with salt. He stood still, hands resting on the railing, listening. For him, the waves had always been more than sound, they were memory, witness, and verdict. Behind him, the glass doors slid open. Daniel stepped out, shoulders slumped, his shirt rumpled from long hours at the docks. His hands were raw, blistered, stained with oil. He had followed his father's command, day after day, until pride gave way to exhaustion. Dad, Daniel said softly. His voice carried none of the arrogance it once held. I came to say. I'm sorry. For everything. For the garage. For the dinners. His voice cracked, and he lowered his head. I don't expect forgiveness. I just don't want to lose you too. Richard didn't turn at first. He let the sound of the surf answer for him. Finally, he spoke, his tone steady. You lost me the night you gave my bed away. You can't undo that. But you can decide who you'll be from here. Daniel's eyes shimmered. He nodded once, the words heavy in his throat. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just accepted. The sound of a car door slamming broke the fragile moment. Melissa stood at the edge of the driveway, a suitcase in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't even look at Daniel. She simply loaded the suitcase into the trunk and drove off without a word. The taillights vanished down the coastal road, swallowed by the dusk. Daniel watched silently, his fists clenched. There was no fury this time, no plea. Only quiet resignation. Richard finally turned, his eyes meeting his son's. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Richard opened the sliding door wider. The guest room is still yours, under the rules. Nothing more. Daniel nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. That night, as Daniel settled into the small guest room, Richard sat alone in the living room, a single lamp casting warm light across the walls. On the mantel rested a framed photo of Margaret, her smile bright, her eyes alive with kindness. Richard touched the frame gently. They tried to erase me, he whispered to her memory. But instead, I erased their power. Outside, the waves pounded harder, like applause rising from the deep. The next morning, Quinn called with news, the trust was finalized. The beach house would one day belong to the hospice, Margaret's name engraved in its foundation. The legacy Richard had built through sacrifice was safe, untouched by betrayal, preserved for those who would value it most. Later that day, Richard walked the boardwalk again. Daniel followed at a distance, his steps slower, heavier, as though he were relearning how to walk beside the man he had once abandoned. Neighbors who had once pitied Richard now greeted him with respect. Some whispered about the demolition, the contracts, the footage. But Richard didn't respond. He let the whispers drift away like sea foam on the tide. At the end of the boardwalk, Richard paused, the wind pulling at his coat. He looked back at the beach house, its glass walls gleaming against the sky. It stood firm, unmoved, a symbol of everything he had endured and reclaimed. For the first time, Richard smiled, not out of triumph, but out of peace. His dignity was restored, his justice delivered, and his legacy secured. The ocean roared behind him, eternal and unyielding, carrying the story outward like a tide. A father betrayed, a son broken, a house reclaimed. And as the gulls wheeled overhead and the waves struck the shore, Richard Harper knew, the world had witnessed, and the waves themselves would remember.